Our very own Ed Wallace was on Law and Crime, talking about the case of Nikita Casap, a 17-year-old from Wisconsin. His parents were found brutally slain, and now Nikita has been arrested in Kansas on various charges. Let's listen in.
I have to find a way to go to sleep, get up, and go on and have a normal life. I haven't found it yet.
Judith Mayer's 17-year-old grandson appeared in court for the first time since he was charged in connection to the deaths of his mother and stepfather.
This is in the District Court of Trigo County, Kansas. It's in the matter of Nikita Casap.
The teenager was not in school for 2 weeks at Waukesha West High School before a school resource officer and his grandmother requested a welfare check at the family home. It's there police found his mother, Tatiana Cassap, and his stepdad, Donald Mayer, dead with dried blood surrounding the scene.
I loved him so much, and his wife, she was lovely.
According to court documents, the teenager left the scene with a gun and their dog in the family vehicle. Police pinged Cassap's phone in Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, Wyoming, and Colorado. On Saturday, police in Waukene, Kansas, pulled him over at a traffic stop where Cassap was arrested and evidence was found. As Cassap appeared for an extradition hearing.
Yes, that's correct.
He has 2 felony counts of operating a motor vehicle without the owner's consent and theft of movable property.
It's the best interest of justice that Mr. Cassap remains in the detention center in Garden City, Kansas.
The magistrate judge gave the state of Wisconsin until March 15th to get him back to Waukesha.
We're waiting to hear back from his lawyer on what exactly happened. It's a little difficult because Wisconsin law recognized Cassap as an adult, but in Kansas, they recognize him as a juvenile. Police arrested him in town near the interstate. The arrest happened just 6 hours after police searched that Waukesha home. Records show police found the driver's licenses of both victims, a .357 Magnum handgun, which belonged to his stepfather, unused ammunition and spent casings, along with the family dog in the car.
Joining us now is retired detective with the NYPD, crime scene investigator Ed Wallace. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. I know you looked through the criminal complaint as well. That did shed a lot of details on this case, though there are still a lot of unknowns. In your experience, if you were called to this scene, you walk into the house, you have this stepfather who's dead, the mom who is dead as well. As an investigator, what are some of your first steps in trying to figure out what happened?
Well, first of all, I want to make sure that I'm there legally. So I would be looking for a warrant or some type of consent. Absent consent, because there's nobody there to give you consent, and the defendant is also residing at this address, I'd be asking the lead detective, please go get a warrant. And then once we got the warrant, I'd make legal entry. But the first thing I'm going to do is a crime scene walkthrough around the exterior of this residence to look for forced entry anywhere, to see if there's any signs of broken windows, broken doors. How did the persons get in and out? Because remember, at this time, we don't know that the son is the defendant. We don't know that he is, in fact, the person that killed the 2 occupants, the mother and the father. Once that occurs, I'm going to document everything photographically on the outside, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the inside. I'm going to put my PPE on, my personal protective equipment. I'm going to put a Tyvek suit with booties, gloves, hood, mask, eye protection. So I'm protecting the scene from me, and I'm also protecting the scene's evidence and its integrity. I'm going to go in, I'm going to walk around, take copious written notes of what I'm observing and what I'm seeing, what I'm smelling, and so forth and so on. Once I've done that, I'm going to back out and then re-enter, taking all my crime scene photographs. After I complete my photographs, I'll do a sketch. I'll maybe do some 3D laser scans of everything so that I've documented everything as I found it, where I found it, in situ, as we say. Well, once that's all done, then I can begin to move things. Once I've documented everything thoroughly. And in the case of the mother, I believe she was covered in blankets and other materials from the house. So I'm going to slowly remove them, changing my gloves in between each item that I'm touching, and packaging these things up to potentially go to the lab for further analysis for trace transfer evidence, gunshot residue, and things of that nature. Now, I understand the mother appeared in the complaint to have an exit wound in the back of her head, and that there appeared to be an entrance into a wall in that area where she was found. So I'm going to do thorough documentation photographically of that, and both the mother's wounds and the ballistic damage to the wall. After I do that, I'm going to get extensive measurements, 3D laser scans of all of this, so I have the exact height of the victim and the location of the height of the bullet wound in the victim's head. Obviously, then we're going to roll the body over and examine the front of the body, looking for the entrance wound, if in fact that is accurate, and document it. Now, from those two wounds, the heights of those wounds, and then the hole in the back, if they're all associated, then we can do ballistic trajectory analysis. And then I would also be looking at the entrance wound for the presence of gunshot residue, stippling, burnt and unburnt gunpowders that may be around the entrance wound. And now we know in this case that a .357 Magnum was recovered in the son's car, the defendant's car. We can take that and the ammunition, if there is gunshot residue patterns around the entrance wound of the mother, and then we can do target to distance testing to determine how far away that gun was when it was discharged to create the entrance wound on the mother. So we can do all of that there as well. Now, since the defendant lives there with the victims, a lot of times fingerprints and DNA are meaningless. But in this case, we would still process like the firearm that was recovered from the vehicle for DNA and also for fingerprints, even though it's in his possession. And also he has their identifications on him as well at the time of arrest. He has their driver's licenses. I don't know what else he may have been in possession of the decedent's property, but you want to look at all of that stuff and you want to try to make the linkage. Now I understand the stepfather purchased that firearm just recently. So, we'll have to look and see if there's any indication of how the defendant came in possession of the firearm. Was it stored properly? Was it not stored properly? Was there a fight with the father? And then the firearm was removed from the father. So we'll have to look at that. And going through the same process with the father, we'll examine the stepfather as well, to see about his injuries and how they may have been occurred. And then there's a whole other series of digital forensic evidence that we're going to look at. We're going to look at all the phone data from the victims and the defendant, and we can try to locate movement of the phones in the residence at the time, before, during, and after the attack, to try to get an idea what the sequence of events were. Okay, was his phone next to the mother's phone first at the time of the assault inside of the house at that location where she was found? Or was his phone by the father's phone at the time of the father's assault? So we're trying to figure out a sequence utilizing all that digital information that can be captured in the phones.
It's incredibly meticulous to go through just as you're describing. And I'm going to ask it in just a little bit, like why it's so important that it is that meticulous when it comes to eventually, if this goes to trial. Again, the son has not been charged in a murder. He's facing charges at the time of this recording related to the alleged stolen vehicle that he was found driving in Kansas. But I want to turn to the wounds that the stepfather appeared to have, according to this criminal complaint, and then what the mom had. And it appears, according to what police saw inside this home with the criminal complaint, that he had a gunshot wound to the back of his head, the stepfather, and then the mom had a wound in her shoulder with an exit wound going out, like we were talking, going into the wall. What does that tell you about how this potentially went down?
Okay, so if you think about this from a combatant standpoint, though, maybe the son perceived the father as the bigger threat of the two parents. So he appears to have shot the father in the back. So it appears maybe the father didn't see him coming. Again, that's a possibility, but we'd have to look at the circumstances. Is there any sign of ransacking or rummaging, or that a fight occurred in the room where the father was eventually found dead and killed there? So we'd have to look at all that. If it's pristine, if it doesn't have any signs of that, it could be an indicator that the defendant came up behind the father and attacked the father from behind. The father didn't see it coming. Okay, and then it appears the son confronted the mother face to face, head on, okay, and shot her in the front, exiting the back and into the wall. And she appears to have fallen there. Now, another thing we need to do is to look at what's called the lividity found on the decedent's bodies. Now, there were some signs of decomposition because the bodies had been there for quite some time before they were discovered. But she appears to have been lying face down in a pool of her own blood, which had dried, and her face had turned black from the decomposition. But you want to look at what's called the livor mortis, is where the blood settles due to gravity. Now, if she was lying in that position the whole time, then the blood will be on the front of her body. But if she was lying in a different position first for some time and then moved into the secondary position, you'll have two sets of lividity that are present in the body. And this will be found out at autopsy, and also would have been found out at the scene by an examination by a crime scene investigator and the medical legal death investigator for either the coroner's office or the medical examiner's office. And the same thing with the father.
If you had two different pools of blood in her case, what would that tell you about what happened?
Well, there might be some movement. She may have been positioned, changed her position from the original place where she fell. You can also have, okay, one site is where she was in fact shot first, and the other site is where she fell. And so then you have bloods. And that's another thing too, that we'd be looking for bloodstain pattern analysis, because with gunshot entrance wounds and exit wounds, all right, we would have what's called forward spatter and back spatter. Now, the back spatter goes towards the gun and the shooter, and then the forward spatter comes out of the exit, okay? And there are two distinct types of shapes and patterns that are developed with these types of bloodstains. And we'd be looking for that at the crime scene as well to document and also to help us fix the position of the victim at the time she was shot. Okay, if she was vertical, if she was standing up, or she was on her knees or so forth, the patterns are going to be in different positions, maybe on walls and other surfaces. So we would look for all that, photograph it, document it, measure it, and then conduct trajectory analysis of the bloodstain patterns.
Now, with the 17-year-old Nikita Casap, he was arrested in Kansas. And at the time of this recording, I'll just say it again, he hasn't been charged with murder. He's been charged with allegedly stealing his stepdad's car and then driving it all the way to Kansas. But police say that they saw this Smith & Wesson handgun in the car in Kansas. And it's the type of gun that his stepdad allegedly owned that went missing from the house. You talk about gunshot residue. Clearly, for me in kind of the peanut gallery, you're like, well, that's got to be the murder weapon, right? But from a courtroom standpoint, when you're collecting evidence, and then eventually if this goes to trial, it needs to be presented as evidence to the jury. How do you link that was the gun that was allegedly used in this crime beyond the fact that it's the same make, maybe it's even the same the same serial number as what the father has? Like, what more do you need beyond just kind of those specifics surrounding the gun?
So there's going to be some ballistics firearm tool mark examination. There's going to be an operation test done at the lab on the gun to show that it's operable. And then they're going to do some test fires on the cartridge cases and on the projectiles, the bullets. And they'll be microscopically analyzed, and they'll be documented, photographed, and put into various databases. Then that wall that sustained ballistic damage, after it's documented, it's going to be opened up, not at the site of the bullet hole, but away from that. And typical construction in the United States, if this is a frame construction, wood cavity walls with sheetrock and on studs, the bullet may or may not have exited the wall and then fell down in the cavity. So we'd go down to the base plate, open up the sheetrock there, and look for that bullet. And if we find a bullet, we'll take it out, photograph it, document it, package it up, get it to the firearms ballistic tool mark examiner, and have them compare that bullet to test fires from that .357 Magnum that was recovered at the inside of the vehicle, the stolen vehicle of the parents when he was arrested in Kansas. Now, the same thing at autopsy. Now, we have two types of bullet wounds on victims. So you have perforating and penetrating. Perforating enters and exits. Penetrating just enters but never exits. So if the father has a penetrating bullet wound, I believe in the skull, and the bullet never exit, then upon autopsy, the bullet will be retrieved after all the documentation is done during the postmortem examination of the victim, and the trajectory through the brain or the skull, whatever the case may be, is documented. And then the bullet will be retrieved. It will then be given to the detectives to bring over to the firearms tool mark examiner.
When we talk about the digital evidence that's been collected, because in the criminal complaint, something that stood out to me was some text messages that the stepfather apparently sent his boss and then sent his family in the days leading up to around the time that it's believed that he lost his life, that he was staying off social media, that he wasn't feeling well. There were text messages that were noted as being odd, according to his mom. What can be done to figure out whether he was the one actually sending those text messages, or if it was someone else, potentially the person who eventually could be charged with his murder?
So they're going to look at the metadata. They're going to look at the data in the phone, and then they're going to contact the service provider for all this information. And part of that information is what was the location of the phone at the time of the text? Okay. Now, also what's going to be, what can be done is, what was the location of the defendant's phone in association with the father's phone at the time of the text? Were they in the same identical location at that time? Was that location in the house or outside of the house? Okay. So was that even?
And it can be that specific as far as, because I know, like, I share my location, like, with my wife, and she can tell that I've been taken forever at, like, the grocery store. But in terms of, like, a courtroom and what is actually allowed to be presented, it can be that specific, where the phone was outside or inside or something like that.
Yes, they're going to do some geofencing. They're going to look at the cell phone towers, and they're going to see what towers were pinging with the information from that phone to link that phone to a specific tower, the father's phone and the son's phone. And
I think about also what you were going through when you first discovered the bodies, if you were an investigator in this case, having to take gloves off for each piece of clothing that would have been on the bodies. Why is it, and I know you want to get it right, but if a crime scene investigator isn't that meticulous, what could that mean when this goes to trial?
Well, if you're not following the standard protocols for crime scene investigations, such as changing your gloves in between each item of evidence, you stand the risk of cross-contaminating the evidence with what's on the gloves. Okay, so you touch an item that may have DNA on it, okay, and you transfer it to your gloves. Now, if you don't change your gloves in between the items and you touch the next item to package it up, you can then potentially transfer that DNA from your gloves to that item when it was never there in the first place. Okay, so we have to be very meticulous on what we do.
How long does it take to search a scene like this, just based off of what we know they were able to collect from this criminal complaint? How long does it take to actually do all that?
Well, it's hard to put a specific time on the crime scenes, because each crime scene is unique. Each crime scene is different. And even though we have two bodies here, and so we have to pay meticulous attention to these bodies and their conditions and their positions and all of that. And if you're talking about scanning, 3D laser scanning, and you're talking about full-blown forensic photography and searching with alternate light sources for hair fibers and maybe signs of the crime scene being cleaned up, blood being wiped away, or whatever the case may be, it could be quite time consuming. So, I wouldn't really want to put a number, an hourly number on that, but I would take my time and do whatever is needed to get a thorough investigation done.
And then just in your experience, you look at what investigators have at this point. It's unclear whether Nikita Casap, the 17-year-old, will be charged with murder. He's, at the time of this recording, being held in Kansas, and then eventually will be brought back to Wisconsin, where he may face charges of murder. What do you make of the evidence they have thus far, and how strong a case it seems that they could have if they were to file murder charges?
Well, here's the thing. He's not going anywhere. So he's being held on those in Kansas on those charges, right? I mean, he can be extradited back to Wisconsin, I believe, right?
Yeah.
On those charges, and then held in Wisconsin, which gives the law enforcement agency time to conduct as thorough an investigation as possible in this case. And they're going to be issuing warrants and subpoenas for records from the cell phone companies. They're going to get warrants for the vehicle because they want to look at the infotainment system inside of the vehicle. And they're going to look at all that information shared between his phone and the vehicle and what was going on there, and the movements around the nation, because he drove all over the country.
Right.
So I know he was in Colorado. He was in so many different states in his trek away from on the crime scene. And so all that information, who was he talking to? Who was assisting him? Who was texting him? Was he getting help from anybody? Okay, so all that information has to come out. Now, the crime scene in and of itself, the residence, that should, I would guess that would take a couple of days, if that, because I've had similar scenes where I was able, with my partner, because we work in teams of 2 in New York, to do a very thorough crime scene in a full day on something like this. But there's no reason to rush, though. There's no reason to rush here, and therefore, when you rush, you make mistakes. So you take your time and you dot your I and you cross your T, and then you're constantly reevaluating what you did. You're constantly reaching out to the lead investigators who are doing independent investigation. They're not doing the forensics. They're shaking hands with doorknobs, as we call, for canvassing the neighborhood. They're getting ring doorbell video camera information. They're getting all kinds of digital information, and they're going to put this case together as thoroughly as possible. So I'm constantly getting feedback from them. Hey, what's new? Is there any new information that you could share with me that would make me look for something inside of this crime scene that I haven't already looked for? Okay. And so we share the information back and forth. I tell them what I discovered and what I've collected and what I'm going to do with it and what lab analysis I want performed. And then they tell me, okay, well, this witness said this. Okay. Or this witness said that. Can you look for this? Can you look for that? That type of thing.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear because, and I'm sure you get this a lot, is, people watch CSI and think that the crime scene, it takes about, 20 minutes to process the entire crime scene, but there's so much more that goes into it. And in this case, it goes across several states. There's certainly the digital footprint, but also what's found in this home in the village of Waukesha, Wisconsin. Ed Wallace, former NYPD detective, crime scene investigator. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us here on Law and Crime.
Thanks for having me.
So folks, how did Ed do? Leave a comment for him below. Thanks for watching.